Chapter 7. The General, 1999-2001.
After Musharraf had come to power in a military coup in 1999, many of us in Pakistan hoped he might bring a new lease of life to our country, following years of unstable and corrupt civilian governments. Nawaz Sharif's plans to award himself dictatorial powers under the 15th Amendment were a genuine threat to any hope of establishing a proper democracy in Pakistan. Thank God we are saved, I thought at the time, as Musharraf promised to hold fresh elections, introduce genuine democracy and clean up corruption. Initially sincerity oozed out of him. Yet even at my first encounter with him, in a secret meeting a few months after the coup, the alarm bells should have rung. I should have realized then and there that the general had no vision and no understanding of the importance of the rule of law. He had already issued his first Provisional Constitutional Order, PCO, and thrown a few judges out, but he had left two of the most corrupt judges in place. So I took the opportunity to ask him why he hadn't cleaned up the judiciary properly. Surely, I said, if his main concern was good governance and curbing corruption, this was the first thing he had to do, because only a strong, independent judicial system can act as a check and balance on an executive. All of the worst instances of corruption in developing countries come from politicians having too much power. The reason they get away with it is because the judiciary is always subservient to the executive, or is in fact an extension of the executive. Imran, Musharraf said, if we touch the judiciary we'll become pariahs for the international community. Of course he'd already done this himself. As it was, he should have worried about fixing Pakistan first, and then worried about the rest of the world. If the people of Pakistan had been behind him, he could have handled the world. As he was to find out 7 years later, when he did remove the Chief Justice, even the backing of the world's only superpower could not keep him in power when the people of Pakistan turned against him. The same thing happened to the Shah of Iran, and more recently Hosni Mubarak in Egypt and Zine El Abidine Ben Ali in Tunisia. When the Iranian people turned against him, there was nothing the Americans could do to save him. At first, many of us overlooked Musharraf's early errors, thinking he was being badly advised, or that he did not understand politics. And we had been so disillusioned by the corrupt governments of Nawaz Sharif and Benazir Bhutto that had ruled Pakistan for the previous 11 years that we were full of hope. In the end, though, it became apparent that his only vision was how to keep himself in power. Every compromise he made was to strengthen his own position. Just as an earlier dictator, General Zia-ul-Haq, had seized on the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 to make himself indispensable to the Americans, so too did Musharraf use the 9/11 attacks on New York and Washington to bolster his position. On the 11th of September 2001, I was speaking at a political rally near Peshawar, the capital of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, when I heard about the attacks on New York and Washington. As we watched the second plane fly into the tower live on television, I felt a sense of foreboding. Like many, I was shocked and appalled by the sight of people so desperate to escape the inferno inside that they threw themselves out of the building. Never had I seen such a horrific tragedy live on television. It had a huge impact on everyone I knew. My first thought was to hope the hijackers weren't Muslim, my second was to hope they weren't Pakistani. When it emerged they were Arab, I knew that nothing would ever be the same for the Muslim world again. As far as Pakistan was concerned, though, the fact that none of its nationals were involved made little difference. A media circus descended on Islamabad within a week and we suddenly found ourselves on the front line of the war on terror. Musharraf, previously viewed with suspicion by the Americans, suddenly became a key US partner. When US President Bill Clinton had come to Pakistan in 2000, he had refused to have a photograph taken of them shaking hands, so wary was he of being seen to endorse a military dictator. But all concern for Pakistani democracy evaporated after 9/11, as Musharraf became Washington's greatest ally against Islamic extremism. US dollars poured into the country, just as they had in Zia's time, as Musharraf helped the Americans against Pakistan's former Afghan Taliban allies. After 9/11 he rounded up hundreds of people and handed them over to Washington for bounty. According to the charity Reprieve, 95% of the people handed over by Pakistan were innocent. In his memoir, Musharraf declared that he had transferred over 700 Al-Qaeda suspects to the United States, yet in doing so he had violated Article 4A of the Constitution, which states that any person on Pakistani soil cannot be given over to another authority unless he is taken to a court of law and provided with the chance to prove his innocence. Musharraf violated the law of the land to prove to the Americans that he was a bulwark against Islamic extremism, just as many Arab dictators have done over the years. The United States in turn used Musharraf, its commitment to democracy, so loudly proclaimed during its later invasion of Iraq, abandoned in favor of the war on terror. It cared only that the Pakistan army should be used as cheap mercenaries in America's war. Just as the Americans had done with Zia, they preferred one strong military ruler to a chaotic and demanding democracy. General Ehtisham Zamir headed the political wing of the Inter-Services Intelligence (ISI) agency, and was tasked with bringing together General Musharraf's coalition of reform. He was looking for my party's support for the general, to give him the strength to take on the crooked politicians. After the referendum, in spring 2002, designed to give legitimacy to Musharraf's presidency, we met again and he told me of the Grand National Alliance, and that's when the alarm bells started ringing. Zamir gave me the ISI's assessment of how many seats each party could get in the autumn elections. I asked about the plans to get rid of the corrupt politicians, and he told me about the reality, that it was unfortunate but the people of Pakistan voted for crooks. I realized we'd been led up the garden path and, for short-term gains, the long-term interests of Pakistan were going to be crucified. Sadly, this has been a legacy of intelligence agencies in Pakistan who, without a proper broad-based analysis, have made decisions which have proved disastrous for our country. Other secret agencies have done tremendous harm in the world, especially the CIA, which for short-term goals has created so much chaos in so many countries. This was my first experience of dealing with the ISI. After that, I resolved never to let the agencies influence our decision-making in the future. I met Musharraf for the fifth and final time on the 23rd of July 2002, when he invited me to President House in Islamabad. I was hoping to change his mind about making this coalition of crooks. It was then I realized how much those of us who had supported him initially had been fooled by his promises to clean up the political system. Also present were Musharraf's spokesman and national security advisor, along with the head of the ISI, and Zamir. The meeting was friendly enough at the start, as he told me he wanted me to join his coalition. He claimed that he had always thought that I was the only clean politician in the country. When he told me who the politicians were in his coalition of reform, I was shocked. Some of these politicians were considered the epitome of corruption in the country, and I told Musharraf that joining them would lose me all credibility, since my main platform was anti-corruption. Musharraf said that if I didn't join him I would lose. I told him I would rather lose than discredit myself. Benazir and Sharif had been personal friends before they joined politics. The only reason I opposed them was because of their corruption. They did at least have a vote bank, though, whereas some of the politicians in Musharraf's so-called coalition of reform that he wanted me to join were both crooked and without a vote bank. I warned him that if he insisted on associating himself with these corrupt politicians, then Benazir and Sharif would benefit. People by this point were sick of their corruption, but if Musharraf went ahead with his coalition of the crooked, the voters would reason that all the main parties were corrupt anyway, leveling the field again for Benazir and Sharif. Unfortunately, people in Pakistan vote for crooks, he said, repeating the phrase I'd heard before, telling me that I was too idealistic and to be pragmatic. I told him that he should have put in place a strong judiciary, an independent election commission, a credible national accountability bureau, and then held free and fair polls. If you had done all that, I said, you'd be the biggest name in Pakistan after Jinnah. He said there was a risk involved. It was then that it occurred to me he meant a risk for himself, as opposed to for Pakistan. He could not comprehend the potential damage to the country from his alliance with corrupt politicians. It dawned on me that he had a naive belief that as long as he was in power he could control anything. He had no idea about the mess he was creating. Up till then I had assumed Musharraf was being misadvised by his close aide Tariq Aziz, but now I realized that rather than helping him form some kind of political vision, advisors like Aziz were simply counseling him on how to stay in power. That was my last meeting with Musharraf, and from then onwards our paths diverged. By not joining Musharraf, my party fell between two stools. Because we had previously been seen to be close to him, we were not considered an opposition party. But now we were firmly out of the establishment-backed coalition. Consequently, a lot of potentially good candidates abandoned us. The ones that were left were turned on by the ISI. Its agents either threatened the Tehreek-e-Insaf candidates or cajoled or lured them into Musharraf's PML-Q, the Pakistan Muslim League, a breakaway from Sharif's party, distinguished by the Q for Quaid, short for Quaid-e-Azam, or Great Leader, the title given to Jinnah. Some candidates gave up altogether, telling me they could not fight the AC. They said they would be wasting their money. Cash is essential for political candidates in Pakistan, who can spend a minimum of 10 million rupees in rural constituencies. No politician in the country's history up till then had ever beaten the establishment. From October 2002 onwards, my party went through the most difficult period of its existence. Although following the 1997 election rout things had been extremely tough, it was after the elections in 2002 that we went through our toughest phase. Having just one seat and with the entire party in disarray, it became a question of survival, just keeping our heads above water. I have no doubt that had I not won my seat, against all odds, because the entire government machinery was working against me, it would have been all over for my party. I won with a 5,000 vote margin, a record to that point for the constituency. Having that one seat meant I could just keep the party alive, but it was hard, as barely 20 of the top leadership were active, and even they were difficult to keep motivated. Others either left the party or became dormant. One positive of this difficult period was that I realized who were my real team. It's only in a crisis that you know the worth of those around you. The one man who resolutely stood beside me through thick and thin was Saifullah Niazi. The other who was a great support through these tough times was Rashid Khan. It took me a year to clear the debts the party had incurred during the elections. We moved out of our big central office in Islamabad and shifted the office into my parliamentary lodge, given to me as Member of Parliament. I cleared our last remaining debts in an unusual way. I was with my family in England, and my brother-in-law, Ben Goldsmith, kept asking me about what would happen in an England vs South Africa test match. I discovered his interest came from his spread betting on the game. I decided to watch the match, and learned he'd already lost about £10,000 on the game, so I told him that in order to give him tips I would have to watch the match, and that every pound he made after recovering the £10,000 he'd lost would go towards clearing my party's debt. I have never gambled in my life and have never understood its attraction, but now for the sake of clearing my party's debts I watched the test match with Ben for the next 2 days, telling him what to do and when. Not only did he clear his debt, but we made enough money to clear my party's debt as well. At one point the bookie asked, "Mr. Goldsmith, you don't happen to be sitting with your brother-in-law, do you?" For the next few months, the party had to be run on a shoestring budget. No one donates to losers. For the next 3.5 years, the party fought for its life. The one thing that saved us was independent television. From 2004 onwards, I had access to the TV current affairs programs, and I took clear stands on various issues, especially on the war on terror, which I always felt was a disaster for Pakistan while it enriched the elite, and from March 2007 onwards, standing with the Chief Justice in his struggle against the President. In my view, Musharraf really started to go downhill after the 2002 elections. He had tried to split the opposition to guarantee victory for his own party, the PML-Q, by encouraging the Muttahida Majlis-e-Amal, MMA, a coalition of religious parties. But his plans backfired when almost the entire Pashtun belt voted for the MMA in protest against the US bombardment of Afghanistan. Since I had been canvassing in 2 constituencies in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, I knew that all the Pashtun would vote for the MMA in sympathy for the Taliban, who were now considered fellow Pashtuns fighting the American Goliath on the other side of the border. But the intelligence agencies, who were orchestrating the elections for Musharraf from behind the scenes, had never expected them to do so well, and the MMA's success upset his carefully laid plans to rig the outcome. After the polls, Musharraf struggled to pull together enough politicians to obtain a clear majority. Despite his commitment to fight corruption, he was forced to bribe and blackmail some corrupt politicians, who accepted promises of posts as ministers in return for cases against them being dropped. But even dictators have limits on their authority, and in Musharraf's case the challenge came from the judiciary, the very judiciary whose importance he had overlooked when he first came to power. In late 2006, Chief Justice Iftikhar Chowdhury had embarrassed the government by reversing a high-profile decision to privatize Pakistan's steel mills, and Musharraf began to think he was becoming too independent. The Chief Justice had also initiated investigations into the forced disappearances of people believed to have been detained without due process by the Pakistani military and intelligence services as part of their contribution to the war on terror. Worried that Chowdhury would refuse to allow him to flout the constitution by contesting presidential elections due that year while remaining head of the army, Musharraf suspended him on the 9th of March 2007 on allegations of abuse of office and nepotism. He had not, however, anticipated the strength of the popular reaction. A move that might have been carried out quietly in Zia's day, when the only TV channel was the government-owned one, was now loudly broadcast by the independent television media. Ironically, Musharraf had during his regime encouraged the boom in commercial television channels. And initially he was the chief beneficiary as he came across well on television compared to the discredited politicians. A more active media was not to his advantage, though, once his popularity started to wane. Developing countries persist because the governments are not held to account by a judicial system. Corrupt politicians cannot afford to allow an independent judiciary. In Pakistan, every military dictator has subjugated the judiciary. Sadly, even the democratic governments have never allowed an independent judiciary to flourish, from Bhutto, through his daughter Benazir, to Sharif, whose senior party members physically attacked the Supreme Court. There are currently 15 injunctions from the Supreme Court, including those dealing with corruption, being defied by Zardari's government. Musharraf now tried to crack down on the judiciary as protests against his treatment of Chowdhury spread like wildfire. The Chief Justice refused to stand down, and the media and opposition parties, my party being in the forefront, leapt to his defense as our country's lawyers took to the streets for the first time. A constitutional crisis threatened as the wave of public sympathy for the lawyers' movement stoked calls for an end to Musharraf's 7.5-year military rule. This was a defining moment. The Chief Justice was supposed to uphold not only the rights of individual Pakistanis but also those of the country's institutions and the constitution. If the state could not even protect his rights, how could it protect the rights of the most vulnerable sections of society? The lawyers' movement was a significant development for Pakistan, offering hope of a plank of civil society activism that did not represent any particular religious or political group. The way in which the surge in independent media had sharpened political consciousness in Pakistan was consistently underestimated by Musharraf, and later by Sharif and Benazir. After years of only state television, PTV, there was now a plethora of current affairs programs and chat shows to fuel debate about the state of the nation. My party was the greatest beneficiary, enjoying an upsurge in popularity thanks to the greater visibility the media provided and the way in which it was highlighting some of the issues we stood for. One of my party's main demands when I had founded it in 1996 was for an independent judicial system, and for years ours was a cry in the wilderness. Finally it was an idea whose time had come. The one most powerful name behind the entire lawyers' movement backing the Chief Justice was a founder member of Tehreek-e-Insaf, Imran Khan. While he controlled the lawyers' movement from behind the scenes, I was able to mobilize my party and the politicians behind the Chief Justice. The first press conference was held in conjunction with Qazi Hussain Ahmad, then the head of Jamaat-e-Islami. Chowdhury set off on a tour of courts and lawyers' associations around the country, drawing huge crowds of people who tossed rose petals at his cavalcade and called out anti-Musharraf slogans. On the 8th of May, along with my party members, I spent a night outside Lahore's Data Darbar shrine, built in the 11th century, waiting to welcome Chowdhury to the city. He was supposed to have arrived by early evening but had been waylaid on the Grand Trunk Road from Islamabad by crowds of well-wishers waiting at the roadside to greet him. So he did not make it to Lahore till about 7 a.m. All night streams of people from Lahore's old city kept coming up to me to talk about what was happening. It was then that I realized something quite incredible was taking place in Pakistan. There was a general awakening of the public for the first time since I had entered politics. As the sun came up, a man shouted from the distance, "Imran, Sahib, a new dawn is rising." I'll never forget that. Pakistan had changed. The strength of support for Chowdhury panicked Musharraf, which showed a few days later in his handling of the Chief Justice's trip to Karachi. Chowdhury was due to address the lawyers of the Sindh High Court Bar Association, but his visit turned ugly. At least 39 people died and more than 100 were injured after the Muttahida Qawmi Movement, MQM, allies of Musharraf, attacked Chowdhury's supporters. The MQM, initially founded to represent the interests of the descendants of the Mohajirs, immigrants who came from India in the bloody tumult of partition, now essentially operates like a terrorist organization. Karachi is their stronghold. MQM gunmen fired straight into a procession of political parties heading to the airport to receive the Chief Justice. At the time, I was participating in a live television program called Capital Talk. In the studio we watched real-time footage of people bearing MQM flags and firing into the crowds with Kalashnikovs. But the television anchors were so petrified of stating the obvious, that these were MQM supporters, that they kept referring to them as militants. The Secretary General of my party, Arif Alvi, called me on my mobile to tell me that he and other party members, who were there to demonstrate in support of Chowdhury, were under attack by the MQM gunmen. He said the police and the paramilitary Pakistan Rangers just stood by and watched the mayhem. Amongst those injured were 10 of my party members. Luckily all survived. While once upon a time in Pakistan the public would have been shielded from an event like this, now it was all broadcast on television. Human Rights Watch slammed the government for arresting opposition activists in the run-up to Chowdhury's visit. It suggested it had deliberately sought to foment violence in Karachi, and failed to rein in the unrest, whether through incompetence or complicity. Musharraf's liberal credentials were in tatters. Furious, I decided to try and get the MQM leader Altaf Hussain charged in London, where he has lived in self-imposed exile since 1992 because of assassination threats. It was impossible to have him tried in Pakistan. People are too terrified of the party to testify. When there was a hearing into the violence in Karachi, proceedings were disrupted by crowds of MQM supporters and it was postponed indefinitely. I gave Scotland Yard a file on Hussain but witnesses were too cowed to come forward even in London. Then Musharraf, and later his successor Asif Ali Zardari, denied the British police permission to come to Pakistan to interview witnesses. By the 16th of July, Musharraf was forced by public pressure to reinstate Chowdhury. But the general was now badly weakened. He tried to recover some ground by reaching a deal, brokered by George W. Bush's administration, with Benazir Bhutto. Having fled the country in 1999 to avoid corruption charges, she was allowed to return to Pakistan to contest elections. In return for her agreeing to share power with Musharraf, with her as Prime Minister and him as President, he introduced the National Reconciliation Ordinance, NRO. This meant all corruption cases against her and her husband, Asif Ali Zardari, were dropped. This was made out to be something like South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Initiative, but it was in a completely different context to post-apartheid South Africa, where it had been a question of bringing two communities together. More importantly, there was no truth. None of those people ever admitted to corruption, including Zardari. They thought by using the word reconciliation, they'd be exonerated, as if this was all about political victimization. All the billions lost to corruption were waved aside by this ordinance, which later was annulled by the Supreme Court as being against the law of the land. This ordinance would come to have disastrous consequences for Pakistan. Now we have many criminals sitting in many key positions today. Corruption would turn to plunder. Yet still Musharraf remained weak, and still he remained threatened by the judiciary, who could potentially wreck his plans to get himself re-elected as president. The deal signed with Benazir, at the time one of the country's most popular politicians, gave him the political space to make his next move. In October he won the presidential polls, but controversy over his eligibility to stand rumbled on. On the 3rd of November, he sacked the Chief Justice, purged the Supreme Court, declared a state of emergency and muzzled the media. That's when my arrest warrants were issued. As I warned in an article one wrote for the Pakistani newspaper The News while I was in prison, Musharraf was in the process of implementing the first phase of his plan to gain power for another 5 years with a massive crackdown on the genuine opposition, lawyers, human rights activists and the civil society. He is hoping that the police brutality will induce enough fear in the people for him to crush all dissent within a couple of weeks, before he takes the next step of getting himself endorsed by his pocket judges. He was already planning to hold parliamentary and provincial elections on the 8th of January 2008. I was worried the issue of the judiciary would soon be forgotten. Even the other politicians did not really want an independent justice system at that point. They changed their tune later when they realized it was a popular issue. Musharraf had hoped to use the cover of the U.S. war on terror to justify the need for extreme measures to crack down on domestic dissent. Sure enough, a few weeks after the declaration of the state of emergency, the new judges he put in place removed the final legal challenge to his re-election, clearing the way for him to resign as army chief as he had promised, and be sworn in as a civilian president. As it turned out, though, the general had overreached himself, and in the end even the Americans could not save him.